The young and the restless spoilers Kane had been running on nerves and borrowed time for so long that exhaustion no longer felt like a symptom but a habitat, a quiet room inside his head where every thought echoed too loudly and every plan tripped over the last one. So in Nice, with the sea pressed like blue glass against the promenade and the light too clean to lie, he told himself to be still, to breathe, to let the frantic signals in his body cycle out before he did something reckless. Again, what he did not tell himself, because saying it out loud would harden it into law, was that he had already chosen not to circle back to Lily, not to make one more pass at the version of life he kept promising her and then pawning when the next crisis hit, because trying again would not be an act of love anymore but an act of selfishness dressed in apology. And if there was one line he still recognized in the blurred boundaries of his world, it was that love did not survive on willpower alone. It needed clean air and honest ground, and he had neither to give. The trouble with deciding to stop is that motion has a memory, and the choices you've been feeding for years don't break just because you say so. The deals keep calling in their clauses, the people you pretended you could live without keep getting hurt, and the ghosts you thought were gratitude turn out to be ledgers that never close. So even as Kane formed the vow to let Lily go and to absorb the damage that would crest when he did, he could feel the next wave lifting under him, one he had felt in the water for months, the cold current of a presence he once welcomed and now dreaded, the certainty that a woman who knew the scaffolding of his rise from rumor to fact would step into his horizon and remind him that his fortunes were not merely earned but engineered, not merely built but bestowed on terms he had long ago agreed to and was now pretending not to remember. Her existence had been the industry's worst-kept secret and Kane's most carefully managed omission, a name spoken in corridors that traveled mysteriously between Geneva banks and New York foundations, a biography that never appeared in glossy profiles yet could be recited, with soft respect and harder fear, by attorneys who specialized in making complicated realities behave. She was the whisper behind his first miracle, the silent partner who made the word billionaire attached to his image before the math had exactly caught up, the patron who produced credibility like a currency and then diversified it into real assets while the world admired Kane's timing, and if he had kept his orbit consistent, loyal, discreet, grateful, perhaps she would have stayed a rumor, but he had not, and rumors harden into arrivals when the person at their center starts believing he can reassign loyalty as if it were a line item on a quarterly slide. The accounting of how they met was less romantic than the myths Kane sometimes told himself when he needed to feel like he had seduced fortune rather than been recruited by it. She had found him at a moment when his competence outstripped his institutional backing and his hunger made him ruthless in small ways that suggested he could be disciplined into being ruthless in large, and she had offered him a machine. A family office with corridors inside corridors, a lattice of holding companies that would let him move from promising to inevitable, a crisis communications firm that could transmute inconvenient facts into cautionary tales about envy, a philanthropic arm that would seat him next to ministers and rectors in rectitude, and, more than any of that, a legend, the myth of a builder whose instincts made money appear as if by gravity, and all of it had come with paperwork, of course, and something more binding than paperwork, a ceremony in a jurisdiction with very tasteful registries, a vow that was less about forever than it was about parity, each protecting the other's leverage against the world. Kane had told himself that the union was strategic and therefore not untrue, that affection could follow function, that transparency was a luxury for people with less to lose, and when the arrangement asked small things he gave them, and when it asked bigger ones he argued and then gave them too. And if his heart kept turning back toward Lily in the unguarded hours, he kept that as a private rebellion with no operational consequences. Of course there are always consequences, and in time the private rebellions grew legs, learned to leave the house, started buying plane tickets to cities like Nice where memory can be rewritten as a new start simply by waking up to a different coastline. Kane did not announce his defection because he could not admit to himself that it was a defection. He called it rest, reflection, the moral thing to do for Lily, a pause before telling the truth, and all the while he believed distance would blur obligations into options. But distance is only geography and power is logistics, so when he landed at Côte d'Azur with a minimalist bag and a plan to practice breathing, the network that had once glided under him like a private runway continued to run. its daily checks and noticed his flight path not because it was suspicious but because nothing in their world was allowed to be random. The first signs were almost courteous. A banker called with the tone of someone performing service, asking to confirm an address for a minor compliance matter that led, gently, to a temporary hold for routine review. The concierge at his hotel, unfailingly composed, mentioned that his preferred driver had been reassigned but another car, even better, would be available on a tighter schedule. A restaurant he had not booked managed to seat him at a table as if he had, a kindness that came with a view of the entrance and the faint impression of being framed. These small rearrangements were signals to a man trained to read signals, and by the third day Kane understood that Nice was not a hiding place but a stage, that the curtains were already rigged and the lights could warm or burn depending on how the audience in the private box decided to turn the dial. Carter's message arrived at sunset with the kind of neutrality that only exists when fear is the editor. A few lines about a delivery to sign in the morning and a question about whether Kane needed anything from Genoa City, and the phrasing, formal, almost sterile, split open a memory that had been tapping at him since the moment his card was declined and then, after a phone call, mysteriously accepted. He saw Carter in old meetings, seated just behind his right shoulder, always to the side of whatever was fragile, never pointing at it, and he recognized that the assistant who knew the names of his tailors and the moods of his lawyers had been a conduit all along, not necessarily a traitor, which suggested something more frightening. That loyalty itself had been administrated through a larger loyalty, and that Carter's fidelity to Kane had always been nested inside a prior fidelity to the architect who paid both salaries. Fear is not always a sensation. Sometimes it is a sequence you can't interrupt, and Kane felt it unspool with engineering precision the next morning when the car that arrived was exactly the kind he preferred but not the one he had ordered, and the driver's route avoided the water with a confidence that suggested he knew the city better than the GPS, and the villa they reached did not announce itself with guards or grandeur but with silence, the deliberate kind that expensive places purchase, and in that silence she appeared, not in the melodramatic silhouette of a conqueror but with the unhurried economy of someone who has already paid for the scene and therefore need not perform in it. The shock was not that she was beautiful or powerful, Kane had always known both, but that she looked like the sum of decisions he had been postponing, a living invoice for the years he had spent wanting out without writing the words down. Her power was not the cartoonish kind that throws people into cars. It was the legal kind that locks doors by calling people who do not raise their voices, the reputational kind that turns former confidants into careful acquaintances overnight, the institutional kind that converts money into influence and influence into inevitability. She could freeze him without touching him, and even as he sat he could feel his life being recalculated in the systems that decide who is solvent, who is trusted, who is expected at the table and who suddenly receives an apologetic email about protocols. There had been a time when he told himself she was a sponsor with a sentimental streak, a mentor who believed in him so deeply that she conflated his success with her taste, but the reality was more precise. She was a sovereign of a jurisdiction most people do not realize exists, an economy of favors so old it no longer calls itself a debt market, a keeper of files where photographs are footnotes and signatures are stories. And somewhere in one of those files was a marriage license with a date and a registry number and a notarized map of promises that no longer suited Kane's conscience yet remained instruments with teeth. If he offended morality he could forgive himself, but if he offended instruments they would bite. The sensation of being married without feeling married had enabled his spree of rationalizations, but in the villa across from the pale blue of the morning sea there was no oxygen for those rationalizations, only the arithmetic of obligations and the choreography of remedies, and the remedy presented to him, wordlessly but with the force of a verdict, was that everything he thought he could stop would in fact be stopped, just not by his own hand. The leak that had started as rumor about his origin story would be curated into a dossier. The legend of his billionaire ascent would be annotated with the footnotes he had cleverly edited out. The publications that once wrote fawning pieces would receive a new file, professionally compiled, verifiable, irresistible. And those publications would not so much turn on him as update him, And in the quiet before the headlines there would be one courtesy show of that file to the person whose name he had stitched to all of his better intentions, Lily, so that she would never again be required to doubt the wisdom of leaving the table when he invited her back. He told himself he had wanted that truth for her, that it would be cleaner if she saw the proof rather than the plea, and for one steadying second he allowed the relief in before it curdled into the realization that choosing to tell the truth and being forced to endure the truth are very different moral experiences. He had relinquished his authorship, and the woman he had once believed would always prefer the invisible move now chose the visible one because it served the larger stability of her realm, a public accounting that would cauterize his risk and warn off other redundancies in her orbit. Kane tried to picture who she was beneath the roles the industry assigned her, patron, strategist, plutocrat, but that inquiry was indulgence, because the only identity that mattered here was function. She existed to preserve continuity, to ensure that the empires she midwifed were not embarrassingly mortal, and if that meant reminding one of her makers that he was made, she would do so with clinical mercy, which is to say without hatred and therefore without reprieve. Whether she had once been the kind of wife who would talk him out of bad nights or the kind of partner who would meet him at the center of a panic was trivia now, and in any case Kane suspected that tenderness had been the lie he told to make exploitation feel mutual. He thought of Carter again, not with anger but with the clarity of hierarchy. The assistant had never been the leak so much as the valve, a safety feature in a system designed to vent pressure before damage. And if Carter had pinged the villa with Kane's coordinates it was because the machine asked him to, because he had been given a job larger than service, the job of chaperoning a man who believed he was escaping into love when he was in fact trespassing into risk, and while Kane could despise the arrangement he could not plausibly claim surprise, because every clause he had signed had implied this day, the day when preference would end and protocol would begin. The question of why she frightened him more than any competitor had a simple answer that embarrassed him to admit even to himself. Competitors could be beaten or at least outlasted, but she could edit reality. And the only defense against an editor who owns the archive is to create a new story so undeniable it overrides the one she prints. He had not done that. He had written a half-story with Lily and expected the world to let it stand on faith. And now he would pay for that arrogance in the only currency the world respects, consequence. Yet fear, when it finishes humiliating you, can redistribute your priorities, and by the time the car traced the corniche back toward the noise of the city, Kane had made a decision that did not feel like victory but did feel like agency. He would not beg her to pause the release or try to haggle the contours of the narrative. He would not barter Lily's name as if protecting her required another set of lies. He would assume the blow and he would do the one thing his history had not prepared him for, which was nothing, no frantic counterspin, no relocation to a jurisdiction with friendlier courts, no late-night call to a tabloid editor whom he had once overpaid for a softer headline. He would let the story be told and then he would show up inside it, not as the tragic protagonist who claims to have been misled by love but as the man who finally understands that truth is not a verdict to be dodged but a floor to stand on. That posture would not prevent the freezes or the bored resignations or the vultures who would peck at his portfolio. It would not keep Lily from looking at him with a kind of kindness that is colder than anger. It would not repair the lattice of trust that had cracked under his weight, but it would be a beginning that did not depend on anyone else's permission, and perhaps for the first time since the day he exchanged vows that were more about leverage than about life, he would be making a choice that did not require a counterparty. Later, when word drifted back from Genoa City that a packet had arrived at Lily's office with the clean brutality of notarized timelines and that she had read it and then, after a long stillness, placed it back in its envelope and returned to her work, Kane felt something inside him fail and then, strangely, hold. He did not deserve the restraint she was showing, and he would not misuse it by inventing meanings. He would take it as what it was, closure without spectacle, dignity without invitation. The days that followed were administrative in the way endings often are, and if there were moments when the old adrenaline reached for his hands and begged to do something, he reminded himself that action had been his camouflage and had never saved him, and so he learned the unspectacular art of remaining where he was while the story caught up to him, and he walked the promenade when the sun was low and let ordinary people pass him without consequence, and he made lists of what still belonged to him after the edits: skills, instincts, a capacity for detail, and a shame he could alchemize into accountability, and he began, clumsily but honestly, to plot a life that did not require myth. As for her, the woman whose identity mattered less than her function, she returned to her orbit having done what continuity demands, and the industry, which has the attention span of a market and the memory of an elephant, archived the scandal, marked him down, and then, because narrative needs friction, watched to see what he would do, and in that weirdly generous surveillance Kane found the smallest privilege a fallen man can claim. The chance to build without pretense under the gaze that once insisted on spectacle. People kept asking who she really was and what power could frighten a man who had seemed to negotiate with nations, and the answers were both larger and simpler than gossip, because she was not a person so much as a position, the post where money meets consequence, and her power was merely the sum of every pause he had taken whenever a contract asked him to decide who he was. If he had made other decisions, she would have been a rumor, but he had not, and so she had become the fact. In the end, what terrified him was not that she found him a nice, Carter or no Carter, someone with her reach would have traced the patterns he left the way a tide traces ashore. But that she did not raise her voice when she held his life in her hands, that she was calm, almost pastoral, as she adjusted the valves and sealed the doors. Because calm is the register of certainty and certainty is the sound of a world that does not need your consent to proceed, and hearing it, Kane understood that fear would remain with him, not as a panic but as a teacher, and that if he wanted a life where fear did not govern he would have to earn it by writing in public what he had been drafting in secret for years, a version of himself that did not owe its existence to anyone else's patience. So he stayed, and he worked, and he did not call Lily, and when the invitations started coming again, not the old ones with gold edges, but humbler ones from places where the work outlasts the noise, he answered some and declined others, and perhaps in time the woman would stop reading the bulletins with his name on them and perhaps she would not, but either way the balance had shifted because he had finally met the one force he had tried to outmaneuver for a decade and found it unimpressed by his speed. And while the world debated the identity of the mysterious patron and traded theories about legal documents in tasteful registries, the only truth that mattered was simpler. Kane was no longer trying to get back anything, not money, not standing, not a love he had repeatedly endangered. He was trying, in the plainest possible sense, to begin. And if the beginning required fear to sit beside him as witness, he would leave it a chair, and if it required him to live for a while under the shadow of a power that could still, with a few calls, reignite the world he was leaving, he would learn the endurance that comes from having nothing left to hide.